This is the second of the panels. We're talking about endpoints and the schedule of events. On this panel, I have Craig McDonald from the University of California. I have Beth Bumgarner, who is a parent, and you've already heard from today. I have Tina Duong, who is a PT from Stanford. Who's next? Linda. And Linda Kripo, I couldn't see, but she is a cardiologist from Nationwide Children's Hospital. Then Jody Wolf from Santhera Pharmaceuticals and Roxana Dragici from Roche. And obviously, you now know Deborah and myself because we've been on stage before. So firstly, thank you to our panelists for agreeing to talk to us about endpoints. I expect some great discussion here. We've had discussion around endpoints with many of you in the last year over this should be included, that should be included. Well, we know all this about that one, but we don't like what we know about it. I know there are some very strong opinions in the room. Just to level set the conversation, what we're trying to do with this platform trial protocol is limit the number of endpoints that we measure to the extent possible so it doesn't cost too much for the companies who need to pay for the trial and to reduce the burden on patients. Because obviously you don't want to come and have a 5-day clinic visit where you're doing a different endpoint every 10 minutes for 5 days. So the idea is to limit the number of endpoints to the degree possible. At the same time, we've already talked today about the fact that we really want to include patients of all ages and stages to the degree possible. So therefore, we all know you can't do a 4-stair climb on a 20-year-old who's non-ambulatory, so we have to have endpoints that would be sensitive to change across disease. Each intervention owner that comes in with a particular appendix can choose one or several of these as their primary endpoint. The others would be supportive. The analysis population may be smaller than the total population with the additional patients, adding safety data, adding supportive data that the drug might work in a larger population. So there's value to every patient that goes into the trial. But in terms of the endpoints, we want to make sure there's something that's sensitive to change in every one of those patients. So obviously we're including lower limb endpoints, we're including upper limb endpoints, we're trying to include respiratory, and to the extent we have them, cardiac endpoints. And we'll be going through and talking about all of these as we go through this panel. So with that as a level set, I'm going to turn to my panelists. And I think our first question is just a general comment to each of the panelists about the selection of endpoints and where we are, and whether there's any major area of Duchenne that we might be missing and we should be including, or any that you think are particularly important to include. And as next to me is Craig McDonald, who has done a lot of work on endpoints. I'm going to hand over to Craig for his comments first.
Well, I think in general the breadth of endpoints chosen is actually excellent. I think it includes skeletal muscle endpoints which bridge lower extremity function with younger patients, upper extremity function, as well as pulmonary function, which is also a skeletal muscle endpoint in my mind. And then the cardiac endpoints I think touch upon a breadth of the disease. I think as we get into the specific discussion about the lower limb functional endpoints and upper limb functional endpoints and so forth, we can perhaps have a healthy debate as to endpoints that should perhaps be considered to be included. Those that on face value may appear not to be included, but actually are perhaps part of the North Star ambulatory assessments. Actually, they are indeed included and so forth. But I think as on first pass, I think the effort is a good initial attempt at covering a broad aspect of the disease and Duchenne dystrophy, both in terms of across the age span, across the disease spectrum span, and then focusing on the different clinically meaningful aspects to a patient.
Thanks, Craig. Beth, would you like to comment on the selection of endpoints as to whether this would be too many for a patient to do, or appropriate numbers, or just your general feeling about the list of endpoints?
I mean, from my experience, they seem to be doable at least for my son. It's similar to what he's been doing. As long as there's some good stuff in the treasure chest, he's on board, so.
Great. So I'm going to kind of give I'm going to wear a couple different hats here for this one. So first, as a physical therapist, and having performed these measures as in the research setting as well as the clinic setting, I don't think this is too much from the perspective of fatigue. I can see the guys doing this, and then in particular, because being a PT, I know there was discussion before that these endpoints are incredibly subjective. I would like to respectfully argue against the subjectivity of it, because it's not just the rigor of being a technician assessing these endpoints. There's a reason why you want your physical therapist to assess this, because it's an effort-dependent test. And so what physical therapists do as a profession is to understand biomechanics and weaknesses and muscle imbalances and how that may affect the ability to produce the force that's required to do these motions. And so the key and the art of this administration of these outcomes is knowing when they really are trying their hardest and they can no longer do it. As these kids are going off their feet, if you have someone who's not trained in that manner to look at it biomechanically, that may be asked of them to do it, and it seemed not as a not valid measure, but it's just they honestly can't do it during that time period. So time-wise, fatigue-wise, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then from a trial list as well, clinical trial perspective, and then it's used from planning all the way to post-marketing. When you're looking at endpoints, the endpoints also have to reflect what may be done after a drug is approved, and that's what's going to be used for insurance approval. I really appreciated what Dr. Woodcock said about the feasibility and access, because we talk about access. This has become my soapbox, because access is not only access at the time of getting a drug approved for a possible homogeneous population, but what does it mean once it is approved? And once it is approved, who gets access to it if there's a broad label approval? Because now you've restricted from patients getting it from an FDA perspective to it being managed by your insurance, who gets able to get access to it. And so I think these measures, there's a couple measures or a few measures that are not only functional skeletal that encompasses the entire spectrum, like the pool, but cardio and respiratory endpoints that also encompass that entire spectrum.
Yeah, so, I'd like to pause and say, Tina, I really appreciate your comments and would like to take those into the cardiac realm. The heart is a muscle too, and I think that if we don't address cardiac endpoints in these clinical trials in a very targeted, goal-directed way, that we are going to be left with a disease where you may be more functional, but you are still going to unfortunately pass away at the same age from Duchenne or Becker muscular dystrophy. And we get one shot at this. When you do these very expensive, very sophisticated, very labor-intensive clinical trials, we can't go back very easily and ask the question, well, now we know what it did to the skeletal muscle. Could we go back and say, did we impact the cardiac muscle? I appreciate the fact that cardiac MRI is not a test that you can get at every center in the United States or in Europe. I appreciate the fact that it does involve more labor-intensive efforts to get good data, but I do think it offers much more sophisticated information about the impact that these therapies are having on the heart. And so I would push from an ethical standpoint, because I appreciate the fact that these are not validated endpoints to be used for approval of drugs, to make sure that we get high quality data that we are going to be able to use to know whether these therapies are impacting our patients and our children's care. And so the point that you made, I think, very well was that there's an obligation to make sure that when we do these trials, that they're being performed in centers that are capable of actually doing this work. And there are many centers that are chosen, sometimes, as we all know, because we want to enhance our recruitment and we want to make sure that we get the numbers that we think we can get, and that may not be the best for our patients. So I think I would just like to add those points as this moves forward.
So we see a lot of the trials that start in the younger kids after approval or after those trials have completed, after the fact answering the question for the non-ambulatory boys. And we know that measuring respiratory and cardiac outcomes is what is going to get access for the non-ambulatory boys, as well as some upper mobility outcomes. So yeah, it's important to answer all those questions at one time. Also with some drugs, we may choose endpoints in a trial based on what will get a drug approved, not necessarily how the drug impacts the whole body and all the systems. And so we may be looking at one specific thing, whether that be respiratory, in Santhera's case, but are left not being able to answer the questions about how it could have cardiac input or how it could influence skeletal muscle as a whole, because there's not preferential towards specific skeletal muscle. This is just how you can measure the drug effect for regulatory approval. I think we do need to think about if we have value to all patients in the trial, and choosing endpoints that are sensitive in all of those patients. And we can talk about that a little bit later when we delve into the specific measures of the endpoints in the platform. But yeah, I think it's a great start.
Yeah, I think this is a good selection of endpoints, especially for serving such a broad spectrum of interventions. I do have two things that I wanted to say. One is a question to Jane and Deborah. I think earlier when you guys showed us all the different assessments that are going to be the minimum in the platform trial, I thought they were to be all done in the same order. Is that correct? Is that something that can be flexible? Because I can see that some assessments are going to fatigue the patients more than others. And for example, a trial that will have a respiratory endpoint would want to have the respiratory assessments first to make sure that the patient is not already tired after performing 100-meter walk and North Star and so on. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is there's this flexibility of adding the intervention-specific outcomes, and I'm not quite understanding how flexible that is in terms of how many interventions or assessments you can add, if any, because that will make some of the protocols more cumbersome than the others and not so attractive. And that will have an impact also on feasibility of performing the protocol in certain countries. And it was mentioned before from another colleague of ours that this platform trial ideally should be implemented outside of the US. And I can see how some assessments, for example, doing DEXA in Germany is not really possible to do that, especially in the younger patients. And the third thing and the last is the inclusion criteria around respiratory. I'm just putting the question out there, how reliable can that be in a 5 to 7-year-old to have an inclusion criteria? And we have Hank here that can address that much better than I can, but I can see a problem with having a 5-year-old having 2 FVCs within 15%, and that would screen fail a lot of patients, and that's a very important segment of the population. And actually, fourth point, it's only 3, but I remembered something else. In terms of limiting the age of the population you want to enroll in a certain protocol, and I think we've heard that you can do that if the mode of action of the intervention would command so, but I think that can be seen from very different angles, because for a reason most of the trials have been in younger and ambulant patients, because once you get into the plateau phase you don't see as much of a decline. So we wouldn't want that to be the same problem in this trial. We would want it to be as broad as possible. And I'll pause there.
Okay, you just gave us a lot of different points to respond to. Yes. So in terms of the order of the endpoints, we haven't yet sat down with the granularity of figuring out what the optimal order of the endpoints is. The idea is absolutely that in every arm they would be done in the same order. So if you're fatigued when you do your FVC in arm A, you're also fatigued when you're doing your FVC in arm D. but what the optimal order is, given that, for example, half your population may not be able to do the North Star and a 4-stair climb, is that we need to figure out what that optimal order is so that it's as equivalent for everyone as possible. And in fact, before we move on to answering any of the other questions, I might see if either Craig or Tina want to comment on that.
On the order?
Yeah.
I actually have a comment about the FVC being inclusion, and from what I understand, the intent is their ability to follow directions and do something repeatably. And so FVC was, please fix me if I'm wrong, probably chosen because it encompasses ambulatory and non-ambulatory. And with having administered it and watching people administer it on multiple videos from all the industry partners, is the following multiple points in direction, taking a deep breath in, blowing it out as hard and fast as you can. And so from that perspective, I think the technicality of instructions is what makes it less variable. And I do have a concern as well, because really the literature does not show that FVC is reliably done under
Yeah.
6 or
Exactly,
7.
6 or 7, yeah.
And so then if that's the case, you're going to miss a whole bunch of really young
Yeah.
kids. who
Especially if
could be
it's
part
not
of
your
the study.
primary endpoint, or you may be focusing on something else. Screen failing patients because of that reason would be a really big miss, I think.
So, yeah, maybe we want to hear from, sorry, that's a little loud, from Hank. Can we get a microphone?
Hank, you get to work again.
To the second to back, exactly. Thank you, Ryan. This one right there.
We're not shy to bring
Because,
everyone into the
yeah,
conversation here.
I mean, it's important, and it's been an ongoing conversation. Where is that sweet spot? And let's.
So in the unaffected preschool population, you should be able to get about 80% success in 5-year-olds in doing spirometry, which probably isn't a whole lot different than 6 or 7-year-olds. It becomes a little bit more dicey below that, though. The CF Foundation has mandated all 4 and 5-year-olds have spirometry done annually, or actually with each visit, because of the feeling you should be able to get most patients get successful testing. If you're looking to maximize, time and efficiency, I think it would be reasonable to expect start data collection at 5 years of age. However, what's pretty clear is that up until 8 to 10 years of age, vital capacity is going to stay pretty stable, and so I don't know that you're going to get a whole lot of data a whole lot of useful data other than just showing stability. And I think the bigger story is where that inflection point is, and you start seeing decline. So my recommendation would be to start at 5 years of age, and I think you'd still, find pretty good success.
I think the question really is using it as an inclusion criteria.
Exactly, yeah.
Because I think in our experience, younger than age 7, there is some variability. Clinically, we begin doing it at age 5, and there's a learning curve involved in Duchenne patients. They don't really, they kind of get it after a couple of years when they've been collecting the data. But I think if the intent is actually to sort of screen out patients who may have difficulty following directions, I think at least in those 5 and 6-year-olds, that could be done, for instance, with a time function test or like a stand from supine maneuver or something like that, showing stability. And then maybe when the patients hit age 7 or 8, then begin to use that as maybe an inclusion criteria. But I agree with you, Hank. I don't think you're going to really use that as an endpoint, in the 5 and 6-year-olds. It's most of them are in the fairly normal range. Yeah. So I would agree with with all of these comments.
If I can add a comment, having to study a respiratory treatment in ages 5 through however old the kids are in the platform, I mean, it could take you a decade or more to figure out if you're stabilizing or changing pulmonary function in a 5 or 6-year-old. So I'm not sure that we really fully understand, particularly my statistician, how that would even work, having kids who aren't declining as part of the trial as a whole. You see what I'm saying there?
So,
yeah.
So the idea of having that broad range of patients is not every endpoint is going to change sensitively in every patient. Your young patient may be changing on standard supine or four-stair climbs. Your older patient may be changing on a respiratory measure. And the idea is to have a measure that's going to be sensitive to change in every patient who's part of the trial. And the mathematics of how that's going to work and the statistical analysis plan for each individual arm is going to be up to the company. Some companies may decide that their analysis plan is going to be on a narrow range of patients and their primary is going to be four-stair climb, and that's okay. Some may use more sophisticated analyses that use a bunch of different endpoints depending on the age and stage of the patient, and that's a discussion between them and the regulators. So in each case, the actual analysis plan will be between the sponsor and the regulators. What we're trying to do is aim to have something to be collected in every patient that we would expect to change. And I know some of the work we're doing in de-risk, looking at models across these endpoints. There are more endpoints in this platform trial than we're modeling, but the ones we're looking at, we are seeing something that would change in pretty much any patient between the age of about 5 and about 25, which is what our data covers.
Well, I'd like to respond to that in some regards, because I think Jody's point is well taken in that if you have something that's going to change in every patient between the ages of 5 and 20, in the younger kids, it's always going to be a neuromuscular marker, but the drug may be critical for cardiopulmonary function. And so if you're going to specifically target or use a drug that is going to target, let's say, cardiac function in a 6-month period of time, you're going to have to change the types of things that you're looking at. So, or the same for
Well, you
pulmonary.
have to add to it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that somehow you're going to have to be nimble with regards to thinking about the protocol for drugs that just don't impact skeletal muscle function.
But then isn't the case where this is like a minimal data set?
Yes.
Right.
So then you
Right.
can add on to specific markers that are specific to the mechanism of action of the drug that's being studied. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, but if you include those patients, then you're actually having more patients in your trial and you're taking longer to recruit and it costs more. So,
Well, and there are going to be some trials where they're not necessarily appropriate for the platform, or they're not necessarily appropriate for the platform, in this first iteration,
Okay.
Okay, that shut that down. But it's also possible that for those types of trials, and this remains to be seen, but the added benefit of being able to have the aggregate data may overcome some of the lost cost savings. Obviously, I think somebody earlier, and I can't recall who, I think it was Joanne, was saying it would have to at least be cost neutral, which is, clearly the case. And in a case like that, best case scenario, it could be cost neutral as opposed to cost saving to do it in the platform. So, I think as we keep hearing, the devil is going to be in the details and sorting out what that business model looks like relative to what perhaps a niche type of an intervention that may require more frequent cardiac monitoring or what have you. That would have to get, the trade-offs would obviously have to get sorted out, but that's very doable.
Yeah, I mean, and as a cardiologist yourself, I think that you'll appreciate the fact that, I feel like I've spent my time in the Duchenne field advocating for the heart, which seems to be a neglected organ, though quite important. So, and I mean,
Yes,
really,
and yes.
right? Yeah. And I do feel like once again, I have to keep pushing for that, because I think, the heart is a muscle too, and if we don't impact the cardiac disease in this disease, we will not have a solution to the problem here. And our sons will still be, and the patients will still be dying at the exact same age. So I think to make sure that we keep in, and the lungs are really important too. I mean, all things in the thoracic cavity are really important. and so we're often in this historically, for a variety of reasons, focused on skeletal muscle, and I appreciate the fact that skeletal muscle is important too. But we can't forget these other organs. The GI tract is important. The biobehavioral health issues are really important. The cognitive issues are really important. And this is a multi-organ, multi-system disease. And I think that if we're going to build this very important platform, we need to make sure that we put endpoints in that are going to allow us to get important data and useful data from these trials, or else this will be a very expensive misadventure, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's exactly why. Wait, we should pause.
I feel like the heart, right?
That's exactly why the cardiac endpoints are actually in there, despite the or assessments, I should say, despite the fact that they're not quite ready for prime time in terms of approvable endpoints. But I think everybody acknowledges, including FDA, that it's critical that the data aggregate so that we're able to understand better and actually define the endpoints.
So I think if you've looked at the list of endpoints, you'll realize that most of the ones we've chosen are pretty well established. They have a fair bit of data behind them. We understand how they change over time. The cardiac endpoints don't fit into that category, but as Linda says, they're terribly important that we gather data about them. We start to understand what a cardiac endpoint might look like. So that's why they're included, because we do recognize it's important. We have a lot more information about things like four-stair climb or 10-meter walk run. We have less data, but still a decent amount on things like PUL 2.0, the respiratory endpoints. The cardiac's still pretty much an open book. We do recognize how important it is, which is why we included those assessments so we can start figuring it out. Craig, you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reserve my comments for when we get into the lower extremity endpoints specifically.
I think that was actually the perfect segue.
Perfect
to
segue.
get into the lower extremity.
Let's talk about the lower extremities.
Exactly, because as you saw earlier, we're including the North Star, the 100-meter walk, and the four-stair climb. I know that there have been some votes for some other lower extremity functional assessments as well. And I'm curious about, Craig, your thoughts on it, Tina, your thoughts on it, and actually moving on down.
So I think this is really an important topic. I think, first of all, just to reassure people, the North Star has the 10-meter run-walk test and the stand from supine as a component of the North Star. So those are actually being obtained. But I think in terms of nomenclature of what's a core endpoint, I would almost argue that the 10-meter and the stand from supine should be sort of elevated to the status of core endpoint. I think it gives added credence and importance in terms of the standardization of the assessment and so forth. And it's part of the North Star anyway, so it's not adding any burden to the patient. The FDA is clearly not wed to the 6-minute walk test. We've had certainly spirited discussions with the EMA where they have encouraged companies, because of previous trials they've conducted, to be able to interpret data in context. The EMA has actually encouraged sponsors to go ahead and include the 6-minute walk test as an endpoint. I was involved in the original validation of the 6-minute walk test back in 2007. And there's a wealth of natural history data, a wealth of placebo data that's been obtained on the 6-minute walk test, imaging data corresponding to the 6-minute walk test that we don't necessarily have with the 100-meter walk test. And so I think that I really question the wisdom of not including the 6-minute walk test as even a secondary endpoint, because it provides a context to help interpret the data. To just give you an example, it took us years to actually demonstrate that 30 meters on a 6-minute walk test was clinically meaningful, or even down to 20 meters. If you actually look at what that extrapolates to on a 100-meter walk test, it's about a 7 to 8 second treatment effect. And I can see us going through the exercise of proving to the regulatory authorities that 7 to 8 seconds is a clinically meaningful treatment effect on the 100-meter walk test. So I think adding the 6-minute walk test, even if it's abandoned after several years for that sort of registry data, that it provides really useful contextualization to the treatment effect that we're seeing. And I can also point to a host of trials where the 6-minute walk test has been the most responsive endpoint, more so than the time function test, more so than the North Star. And even in the recent vamorolone trial, it was more responsive than the stand from supine time, even though the company has gone with the Stanford supine time on their pivotal trial as the primary endpoint. So I think you could give a lot of argument. The other issue is that there's a lot of Duchenne therapeutics that actually are targeting mitochondrial mechanisms moving forward. And I've done a lot of energetics with Duchenne dystrophy. It takes patients about a minute to get to steady state when ambulating in terms of the energetics. And so if you're relying on 100-meter walk data, you really are only about 30 seconds of sort of steady state information or data if you're looking at sort of a therapeutic that might impact endurance or the energetics of the situation. So I think that's the one consideration that I would still throw out there. Maybe not as a core endpoint, but as a secondary endpoint. It takes about 4.5 minutes longer to do a 6-minute walk test versus a 100-meter walk test. The startup time, the finishing time is about the same. So that would be just one point I would have there. But the ambulatory endpoints. Tina, your thoughts?
I would say that if you look up 6-minute walk tests or 100-meter, they're entirely different tests that you're testing. So when you're looking at energetics or aerobic capacity, for example, 100-meter is a sprint. You're running as fast as you can for 100 meters. And so if you look at it, it's like, the Usain Bolt doing a marathon. Those are entirely different. And so when you're looking at mitochondrial or burst or power, you're going to look at the 100-meter. So if I was advising someone who has a mechanism of drug that is going to increase power, maybe the 100-meter is the way to go. That would be in addition to the current platform. 6-minute walk test is a submaximal test. It is a test that's typically and historically used in cardiopulmonary rehab. Right, and so why do we use it? I mean, I recognize there's a lot of, we could throw a whole bunch of endpoints out there, but the endpoints that are part of this platform trial, I can understand why it's in it, because it's what we've used, it's what's validated. And so you have to keep a minimal data set so that the endpoints are all going in the same direction. But that being said, also having administered the 6-minute walk test, it is the one test that the kids hate the most. I dread doing it, they dread doing it, everybody has anxiety around it. So I would love to hear Beth's perspective on what you hear from your sons when they leave me. Because it is something that they always have an excuse for you to say, oh, I didn't sleep really well the night before, I'm not sure I'm going to do really well in the 6-minute walk test. And so.
My thing with the 6-minute walk test is I just don't know from one time to the next, based on what kind of mood he's in that day, how accurate is that measure from this month to 3 months from now. And I don't know. I haven't looked at the data on that. I know that was the thing that excluded him from the first trial that we finally got to screen for, was that he was too fast on the 6-minute walk test. And after the fact, the thought did enter my head, like, well, maybe I should have taken him to the zoo the day before, so he would have been tired and gone slower on the 6-minute, not that I would have done that, but the thought did occur to me. And if the thought occurred to me, another parent might do that. So the subjectivity of it and the fact that, their mood and their, how they're feeling that day could impact that. That's the question I kind of have about 6-minute walk tests.
I think that's the difference between a test that's submaximal versus maximal. In literature in general, when you're doing effort-dependent tests, a maximal test will get you a better reliability. And so a submaximal test, I can be really loud and I can be very cheerful, but if the kid does not feel like moving fast, they're not going to move fast. And so I think the 6-minute walk test is also maybe as tiring for the physical therapist trying to motivate as it is for the patient.
Well, and I also think for a kid who's 9 years old, who's 7 years old, do they understand how to conserve their energy to be able to walk for that full 6 minutes? I'm a runner. I might go out tomorrow and feel great and be able to run a 7.5-minute mile. And then the day after that, I feel lousy and I'm lucky to get an 11-minute mile. You know, I don't, any of us on any day-to-day basis, you know, could have different performance in a test like that. So that's, you know.
So coming back to Craig's comment about just having a comparator, something with a lot of data behind it, I'm interested to hear the perspective of our industry colleagues, Jody or Roxana, about how you feel about not including it, as we have not included it for the moment, given the issues with reliability that Beth and Tina are just talking about.
I don't have a strong opinion over excluding it. Our primary endpoint is North Star, and I support North Star. Secondary endpoint, 4-star climb, so I don't have a strong opinion over excluding it. Obviously, from what's published out there, there's, you know, all the things that we've discussed, certain degree of variability based on the patient's status, motivation. We've heard all these stories with patients standing at the end of the line with, $50 bill or $20 bill and so on. So, yeah, I don't have a strong opinion. Yeah, basically, I'm fine with excluding it. So.
I'm not going to comment on, we work with the older boys. 95% of the guys in our trials are non-ambulatory, so I'll probably comment more on upper limb and respiratory.
I mean, there are current trials being run that are using the 6-minute walk test as the primary endpoint, so I think you just have to maybe ask those sponsors that are using it as their primary endpoint as to whether it would have impacted their enthusiasm to participate in the platform trial if it's not an endpoint. And then there just is the issue of the context in terms of the wealth of historical data that's available prognostically, and try to contextualize the results you're eventually going to get from the 100-meter walk test. I mean, those are the only, I think, added points. I think in terms of motivation, the issue of motivation gets, I think, misinterpreted, because the motivational aspect that the FDA was concerned about with the 6-minute walk test was the use of the endpoint in the context of a long-term extension trial of, say, 3 to 4 years duration, where the patients know they're on the therapeutic agent. The 6-minute walk test actually, performs well in the context of a placebo-controlled trial. Patients don't know they're on, those motivational aspects can be controlled in the context of the trial design and the placebo nature of the trial design. The motivational aspects is, willing yourself to walk longer and so forth. That's really an issue more in the context of long-term extension, open label trials. All these tests have motivational aspects to them. The stand from supine, the 100-meter walk, they all have some degree of motivational aspects to them. It's just you're trying to control for that in the context of your study design.
I just want to make a comment on the reliability a little bit, because I've worked with the 6-minute walk test outside of Duchenne and in adults. And particularly, my first introduction to the 6-minute walk test is Pompeii. And that is entirely an adult study. It was done day 1 and day 2 as a requirement because of the variability that exists in the 6-minute walk test. And that's almost a quote unquote. And so more recently, I worked with a group for myotonic muscular dystrophy, and the recommendation was the 6-minute walk test. But within that caveat was that it should be done twice for the variability that exists, and this is in adults. And so when you add on to the psychosocial aspect of learning and abstract, when we're talking about motivation, the abstract part of the 6-minute walk test is it's 6 minutes, but that is very, very abstract for very young kids. And then you add on top of possible cognitive delays to fully understand that that's a little bit different. And so for me, like, if I know that I need to run as fast as I can to that door, I can probably will myself to do it. But if you tell me I have to run and do that as fast as I can for 6 minutes, that's a little bit harder. And I think that the kids, what I'm seeing is that they don't really understand, especially the younger ones, from that perspective. But I do want to iterate that I fully believe that the 3-time function test that Craig mentioned before should be moved up to a higher degree, not only because of of the way that it's administered, but there's a lot of data behind it from natural history and its validation, and also from a statistical analysis perspective, outside of even Duchenne, you can look at the gait speed, all these velocity measures as a means of predicting loss of ambulation, and we're now looking at anchoring some of these changes, 12-month changes, to a functional change. And so then there's a clinical meaningfulness to the actual not only change in how fast they do it, but the rate of progression. So taking that into consideration. And since that's something that we've particularly looked at with the Synergy cohort, that I have to say that's a pretty important measure to emphasize. Even though it's in here, it's just kind of hidden with the way that's written.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's very, very helpful. I guess because there's obviously some disagreement disagreement about whether or not to include 6-minute walk test. I'm curious to hear from audience members, industry, academia, about whether or not anybody has any thoughts on whether or not to include or to leave out 6-minute walk.
You know, I'll comment just from here. You know, since I don't see any hands at the moment, but we're not going to get an answer to this question, right? I mean, clearly you have, as a person who sits back and listens to these conversations for years, there is as many opinions on this as there are people, and we've just demonstrated that. I don't know if it's either going to be in or out, and you could put it in and see if it falls out later on. To me, it seems like.
Yeah, I think you know one of the possibilities could be you could put it later in the testing order, just so those issues of fatigue and so forth wouldn't be, if you were choosing a primary endpoint, you wouldn't want it. You wouldn't want a 6-minute walk test to be performed right before your primary endpoint. So I think putting it perhaps down later, really, it in terms of burden test taking time, it really only adds about 6 minutes to the protocol. And
No, it's engendered hours and hours in discussion.
Okay,
right. But I do think that at least if you had it in there, you're going to have, similar to natural history or registry data, you're going to be able to contextualize the information you have with this wealth of data that's been collected since 2007 in the context of clinical trials.
No, I think that's true.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say, in the last 10.
Use the mic.
Yeah. The people online probably wouldn't agree.
Yeah, it's the online.
I would say if you asked me this question 15 minutes ago, I would have said leave it out. Having had years and years of experience with the 6-minute walk test, remembering that ours was often affected by a flight and a quiet hotel, a loud hotel, whoever was administering it, my son loved or didn't love, all those things were affected in the 6-minute walk test. After listening to Dr. McDonald, I think he's got a valid point that we have this history, and thinking of my son in particular, years and years of 6-minute walk tests. Yes, there are some variables in there that aren't really, I don't think, considered, right? You didn't consider that we got snowed in Denver while flying to Utah and had a horrible 6-minute walk test, but there's so many of them. To Dr. McDonald's point, there's got to be useful data in there.
I'd be curious. We have a colleague from PTC that PTC probably has as much experience, if not more, than any sponsor with measuring the 6-minute walk test in the context of time function tests and North Star. I'd be curious to see how PTC would weigh in on this question.
Right. So I definitely agree with you. I mean, it's something important to collect because we have so much history on it and we have so much data that could be incorporated with what we knew that we gather. So that's definitely a good thing to have. The way we do standardize it in a way that every site's do it the same way to minimize this variability. But as you said, I mean, there's so much else that can play into it. But I think it's a valuable measurement that can link to the existing data that we have, and then it's a lot of value. All the natural history data we have are all 6-minute walking distance based.
And I'm not pro or con, because you can convince me tomorrow or the next day. I flip back and forth with this quite a bit for all the reasons above. But I guess I just want to throw it out there too. Say tomorrow a drug is approved on the 6-minute walk test. All of those of you who are in clinic, if you're not a clinical trial site, would these clinics be able to do it because of the logistics? Because there's the normal human variability, but then the straight logistics of having a standardized 25, 30-meter hallway to do this. Having set up quite many sites with Synergy, sometimes these things are done, they have to go to the church down the road, or they have to go to another building, because it is just, logistically, it's a harder measure to do from a clinic perspective. So you see.
But for third-party payers and clinical follow-up of patients, I don't do the 6-minute walk test. I do time function tests and North Star. But I don't think you really need the 6-minute walk data with regard to third-party payers when you have an approved drug and you're just following a patient for efficacy.
But for example, SMA is an example where they have the Hammersmith or Chopin-10 was used and that was approved. So now when the insurance is going to say you get this drug or you don't get this drug is dependent on this Hammersmith or this Chopin-10.
Yeah,
to
there
be
are plenty of plans that are requiring 6-minute walk test to be administered over time. Some requiring a certain amount of meters for Exondys coverage. It's not all of them, but we do see it in a number of the public plans. I know not in the California plan, Medicaid there isn't that, but you had a hand in that, working that plan. So.
I know there are a couple more questions out there, and then we really need to move on for the 6-minute walk distance. We've got some other endpoints to discuss, but I know you've been waiting for a long time, and somebody at the back has been as well.
Yes, thanks. So I'm a parent, and as far as the 6-minute walk test is concerned, I echo what Dr. McDonald mentioned, and the two behind me. There's a lot of valuable data there, and I think including it would allow further validation of it, right? So just comparing it to the other endpoints, if things don't match up, then we would learn whether or not it truly is valuable.
Thank you.
That's a good point. And I think the gentleman at the back there has been waiting for a while to.
Thanks. I'm the other PTC guy in the house as well. I just wanted to say, like when you look at these endpoints, you look at the inclusion criteria, they will be used against you in the court of Medicaid. So just keep that in mind, because we just went through this with Arkansas, and they had an exclusion because of ambulation. So they said if the patient was not ambulatory, they couldn't get the drug because in the original inclusion criteria for the clinical trial, they had to be ambulatory. So just beware what you put here will be brought up again, and even to the point with the Chopin-10 and those type of things, they may make you do that, and they may even make you show improvement. So if you show a clinical trial where there was improvement, they will say you have to show improvement in order to get this drug in the future. So just be careful, but 6-minute walk distance or walk test, I think it is worthwhile to include as an aside. So thanks.
Well, thank you for all the commentary. I don't think we'll come to a firm conclusion here, but we've got a lot of information and concepts to take back to the steering committee for more discussion. So thank you all for that. But I do think it's probably time to consider moving on to some of the other endpoints. In terms of the upper body endpoints, we've been considering using the Brooke Scale and the PUL 2.0. Now, I think we all know the Brooke Scale is not very sensitive to change. It's more a staging scale. The PUL 2.0 doesn't have a huge amount of data behind it yet, but is looking reasonably promising. And again, I think I'm going to turn to Craig first, because I know he's done quite a lot of work on the PUL in particular to comment, and then we'll continue down the line.
Well, I think, first of all, I think including both the Brooke and the PUL 2.0 is somewhat redundant, because the PUL has entry criteria, which actually you can completely extrapolate the PUL scale from the PUL entry criteria. There is one additional PUL entry criteria that actually it's a different point scale, but it's just hands to the shoulder height. But you can still extrapolate a full Brooke score from the PUL entry items. So I'm not sure it really needs to be in there, because I think it is actually somewhat redundant. I think the FDA CBER division certainly weighed in on the PUL 1.2 versus the 2.0, and they suggested use of the 2.0 primarily because they were comfortable with the 3-point scale. They thought that a 1-point change was meaningful. And in fact, in the recent trial, we recently completed an interim analysis on the Capricorn trial, which was of cardiocertified stem cells in a non-ambulant population. The PUL 2.0 was actually had better variability measures in terms of coefficient of variation, ended up with a stronger effect size and greater statistical significance. So I think the PUL 2.0 is certainly the appropriate measure. I think the one caveat is that the light can items were actually taken out of the PUL 2.0. Primarily, it was really quite arbitrary because the therapist just couldn't get cans that were not filled with any substance, and so they just eliminated the light can. Now they actually have a source of empty cans, and so I think you could consider actually adding the light can items back in as exploratory endpoints in addition to the PUL 2.0, and then just make a decision down the road in terms of whether those additional items that were originally included in the PUL 1.2 add any additional treatment efficacy data. I think the other measure, which I think should be considered, is grip strength. I think it's fairly reliable. I think if you can compare it with percent predicted normative data, it actually can be quite useful. I'd be curious to see Tina weigh in on that. Laurent Serret's done a lot of work on grip strength methodology, so I think that would be something else to consider with the upper limb.
Yeah, I totally support that too. I think grip is one that makes sense because you have normative data that you can compare to, and it's been done reliably. We have a lot of historical grip data. In regards to the 1.2 versus the 2.0, there was a lot of rash analysis done creating the 2.0. And part of the rash analysis, yes, logistically, we did not want to glue cans together that were empty and light. But besides the logistic problems, what we found was that with the light and heavy cans, there really wasn't a big difference. And administering this a lot, there wasn't a huge difference in just the basic administration of it. Something that was taken out of the 2.0 was the time. And so one of those things is that it doesn't take any more effort. It just takes a little more coordination from the PT's perspective. We may consider that as something that could be obtained, that could make changes depending on what the mechanism of action, because outside of Duchenne, people who has used the pool, they've used the time measure for the upper limb also as an endpoint measure. So that's something to consider. But I agree that 2.0 is easier to administer. I'm not surprised that the reliability is better, but just know that the 2.0 was based on changes were based on a rash analysis of the previous items, and so that's why it's much more succinct. And then shoulder abduction was taken out and shoulder flexion was kept in because there wasn't a major difference in that as well.
Based on our experience at Santhera, we would think that the Brooke Scale isn't sensitive enough of a measure to really meaningfully change or move in a 2-year clinical trial. I mean, it's a 5-point scale, so we'd support removing that and relying on the PUL.
Great. The one important, Tina, you've made this point before, but the PUL 2.0 actually allows compensations, whereas the PUL 1.2 does not allow compensations. And so it's not a simple strategy of just extrapolating a PUL 1.2 score to a predicted PUL 2.0. It's a completely different context in which those assessments are administered. You just can't go from one to the next in terms of some sort of mathematical formula. So you just need to be aware also the PUL 2.0 is really more functionally focused. It does allow compensations, which probably enhances its reliability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with the Brooke, you're mentioning Jody about the Brooke Scale. I think the Brooke Scale is, like Craig said, it's a moot point because the entry criteria for the pool was based entirely on the Brooke Scale, minus adding one item, right? But it's more for staging of upper limb. And so whenever we look at changes in clinical important difference, we looked at both anchoring it to the Brooke and the Vignos. And with that kind of anchor, we saw that with different changes in time function tests, et cetera, it is very well anchored to the Brooke or the Vignos in both the ambulatory and non-ambulatory population. So.
I had a question about the upper limb strength. So given that in the past we've had most of the trials have either been for non-ambulatory boys or for ambulatory boys. So with this trial, you may be starting boys as they're ambulatory, and then through the phase of the trial, they become non-ambulatory. So are we doing these upper limb function tests at the beginning for everybody so that we have that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be for everybody.
Because you would imagine that they would start losing upper body strength
Right.
while they're still ambulatory, and there's a continuum in between. Okay, I know I have at least a couple of panelists down the end of this line who are itching to talk about respiratory measures. So perhaps I will ask Jody to comment first on the respiratory measures that we have included, which are FEC, PEF, and FEV1.
Okay, and that doesn't include MIP and MEP, right? You're not doing those?
No, and I think that was based on some of the work your statistician presented of just the variability of those measures.
Okay, great. So I think going off Beth's point about administering tests across the age range, I think it would be interesting to truly understand why to be measuring pulmonary function in the younger population that aren't declining, and that's in the context of a clinical trial, to be able to show meaningful change in that. When you have kids that are ambulatory and still have very good pulmonary function, you're measuring something that you don't expect to change in any way, but you're also maybe decreasing the reliability of other tests just by including that in the assessments. So I do want to just throw that out there as a consideration. Also, when you have FVC, PEF, and FEV1, we've shown that they track really closely to each other. So it's something to think about, and I would throw this to Hank and Craig regarding whether you really need to be measuring all three. Is there a preference in relying on one or the other?
Well, I think, and Hank can weigh in on this as well. Of those three measures, really only the FEC includes both inspiratory and expiratory muscles. The PEF and FEV1 is more of a focus on expiratory muscles, or the expiratory muscles being more the chest wall muscles, the inspiratory, which would include the diaphragmatic function. I think I would agree that the MIP and MAP and peak cough flow in particular have been quite variable in a clinical trials context, so they haven't been good clinical trial endpoints. I know that Santhera has had some recent post-hoc experience adding in inspiratory flow reserve as sort of a fraction of the maximum flow not used during tidal breathing, and that's really an inspiratory measure. So the only other question I would have would be, in addition to these three measures, whether IFR or inspiratory flow reserve might be considered to be added. I don't know if, Hank, you might have some thoughts on that. Obviously we don't necessarily have the reliability data with regard to that, but do you have any thoughts on, both measures of inspiratory function as well as expiratory function?
I think doing both the vital capacity as a summative measure of respiratory muscle function is certainly the primary, should be the primary outcome measure, but I think that peak flow and then inspiratory flow reserve as inspiratory and then expiratory and then inspiratory specific outcomes are nice confirmatory measures, that if you have a positive signal on all three, it certainly strengthens the results quite nicely. The one thing that I want to point out that might make it easier to tolerate doing the testing is, while all three outcomes can come from a single maneuver of forced expiratory and then a forced inspiratory maneuver, you can also break each component out into a single effort, which is the strategy that Santhera has used with the Sideros trial, and doing just a vital capacity maneuver and then a specific peak flow maneuver without a long exhalation, and then an inspiratory maneuver for inspiratory flow reserve. It may add a little bit more time, but might be more tolerable and might produce more reliable data. But I think having all three is good. The only hesitation is that inspiratory flow reserve, at least from the Santhera data, is not nearly as variable as MIP or MEP, but is not quite as has a higher coefficient of variation compared to both peak flow and forced vital capacity.
And what do you think about FEV1?
It's a
highly
freebie.
correlated. Yeah.
I don't know that it adds anything. I mean, if you're doing a vital capacity maneuver, you're going to get FEV1. It's going to tell you the exact same thing.
And it's highly correlated with the FVC.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
If by chance you have somebody that can't do a full vital capacity maneuver and they can do a reliable maneuver for 1 second, in other words, get you an FEV1, you might be able to salvage a data point. But I don't think it tells you anything outside of, it's not going to give you any additional information.
Hank, so I thought when I was trying to look at reliability with FVC, some of the really pediatric data, they were saying 3-year-olds could do FEV1 if you need a true FVC, because they can't get the concept of the expiration time. But there was this study in very young kids were doing FEV1s on 3-year-olds, and they found that reliable if they're looking at that one particular measure.
I mean, I think in FEV1 in this realm, I think would be reasonable surrogate for a young child. It's not going to have the same utility as usually, and it's not going to be as useful as a measurement of obstructive lung disease, which isn't really how it's being used here in young patients. But I think that would be a reasonable, controlled way of measuring an expiratory outcome in younger patients.
I do want to make one point kind of outside our trial experience from Santhera in a plug for the older guys population. If the true promise of this platform trial is to include a broad range of the population, so in our trial, the boys have to be 80 to 35% FVC. We know that after 35%, they start to plateau in the 30, 20 FVC area. But there's still so much we don't know about how those older boys can benefit from therapeutics. And if we have 35% as the bottom for them to be included in the platform trial, then we lose a whole population of older guys to study and how they might benefit from these treatments. So that's a little bit outside of my role at Santhera, but I do want to just make the plug. I think Russ Butterfield's comments about including a separate arm to be able to still study those kind of things, I think would be really important to truly include that population in trials.
So at the risk of extending the panel even longer, sorry, Abby, I do think that's a really important point. So I'm wondering if maybe Russ, Hank, and Craig could comment from a safety perspective on that and using that threshold.
I was actually going to make a slightly different recommendation and shift to a different outcome measure, such as diurnal hypoventilation or hypercapnia, entitled CO2. So I think once you get down to that point, the general correlation that people make between lung function and ventilation is that you begin to have daytime or diurnal hypoventilation. And so looking at that point by tracking entitled CO2 may be useful. Just don't have it's not quite practical yet to be able to track nighttime hypoventilation because of the complexity of doing the data collection. But that would be one other thing for the future.
I mean, in general, many patients below a 30% FVC, many of them are beginning to use ventilatory assistance during the daytime. I think there are patients that have really well-preserved distal upper limb function who have FVCs of 32%, 30%. So, one consideration could be to slightly liberalize that criteria down to 30%, and then you'd at least be focusing on some of those distal upper limb functions that might be important to certain therapeutics, but probably not really necessarily have that much more of a safety concern going from, say, 35% down to 30%. It might broaden the criteria to allow some of those men to participate.
Right, I agree that there's probably not a safety concern. It's just a trade-off of depth and breadth. Mm-hmm. And we have to define somewhere where the edges are of the study and how deep we can go and how broad we can go. And we just probably have to find the sweet spot for that.
Again, I think this is a conversation we will continue with all of you respiratory experts before we come to the final answer, but this has been some great discussion.
Absolutely. And I think before we end this panel, I just was going to call on Linda to circle back to cardiac for 1 minute and note the fact that we had included both echo and MRI as assessments, cardiac echo and cardiac MRI as assessments in the platform trial. I'm wondering if you could just comment on using on us using them both.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, I'm an echocardiographer, so I live my life using echo as a tool, and I really think in the Duchenne patient population, it is a safety endpoint only. I don't think we can get meaningful information about it. I really think cardiac MRI allows us to look for myocardial fibrosis. It allows us to do strain imaging. It allows us to look at endpoints in a much more sophisticated way. It's sort of like the difference between using a handheld magnifier versus a microscope. If we really want to know the answers to these important questions where we're using drugs to assess small degrees of change, we're going to have to use sophisticated tools. And I appreciate the fact that there is a hesitation in the neuromuscular community to use cardiac MRI, but I can tell you clinically we are using cardiac MRI all the time in our center. We're evaluating kids with congenital heart disease, cardiomyopathies. Our cardiac MRI scanner is busy all day long and in a very aggressive way. We are using cardiac MRI as our primary assessment tool and using echo in differing ways. So I think in the field of pediatrics, echo is evolving as it has its place and will always have its place. But I think in this patient population, I think if we want to be forward-thinking, we need to use cardiac MRI. And echo could be a safety tool, just to make sure that you're not doing significant harm to the myocardium. I don't know how you feel about that, Deborah, but.
Yeah, no, I
And with that,
cannot agree more.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end this panel because we're out of time. I want to thank the panelists very much. I think this is a topic we need a lot more discussion over. I think there are many of you in the audience and in the panel who have a lot more thoughts. So feel free to contact us. I think everyone knows how to contact at least somebody involved with the protocol. But we do still want to hear your thoughts. I'm sorry we have to cut this off at this point, but thank you very much to the panelists.